father could have experienced. I mean, so it's so unique. And it's 50 years later, this year, from that important year of 1963, was a crazy year in the U.S. history. President Kennedy was assassinated, so many other things. So it's a great privilege to have John Donovan join us today to help us appreciate the historical reality of what this means, what our lives, his life, and especially his role in history and the role that we all play in history ourselves. So, John, thank you so much for being here. And
thank you, Bill.
You got a biography.
Reality, because we live in an era in which people imagine that they can just make up their own reality, and that the only virtue nowadays is tolerance, in which you're supposed to tolerate everybody's view of things, which in general is a nice idea and a good thing to do to maintain order. But there is an objective reality, and one of the best ways that we can understand that is by looking at actual occurrences. And it's also interesting to note that along the way in history, various figures, including and especially during the Cold War, tried to create their own historical reality, tried to remake society, remake civilization according to their concepts of reality. And I think many of us understand what the results of that have been over the years. So I will add, however, that I would like to propose today that we begin to remake civilization ourselves, but not according to some wild idea or according to some way that we can imagine to gain power, but according to a far more objective reality. So the topic of my talk today is 1963, 50 years ago. And I was 18 years old at the time. I want to begin by talking about the fact that my father, who has been deceased now for 43 years, was a New York lawyer who was hired by the people who were the relatives of the Bay of Pigs veterans to go to Cuba and negotiate the release of those Bay of Pigs soldiers. As you may recall, these were the Cuban exiles in Miami who were trying to return to Cuba to overcome Castro's government and return it to the previous situation. That attempt failed. It was organized by CIA. It failed. The men were put into prisons, and my father was able to negotiate their freedom at the end of 1962. Now, there were still some American citizens in prison down there, and he wanted to get them out. Meanwhile, some people around Castro were telling him that my father, James Donovan, was just a decoy for an impending American invasion, that he shouldn't be trusted. So my father had this idea, well, he would bring his 18-year-old son down there, you know, as a gesture of confidence, he called it. And so I went down there, and I'll tell you right off one of the most extraordinary experiences that I had. We drove down with Castro to the Bay of Pigs, and we got out on a boat, a little fishing boat, really, there on the Bay of Pigs. And I remember standing out on the deck of that boat, and Castro came up to me, and he began to speak in a kind of broken English, and he said, "I think you have some questions for me." And so he was wearing a skin diving suit that my father, in fact, had given him. And so I said, well, yes, actually. Why do you think you can just take away the freedoms of the people of your country? And so he made an interesting response. He said, is a man free if he can't grow enough food to feed his own family? He asked a couple of questions like that. In other words, he brought it into the broader communist kind of reality, But it was an interesting response that I've always remembered. But the actual thing I want to tell you right now is about that skin diving suit, because it turned out, as it was revealed in later years, that the CIA had a plot to assassinate Castro, and in various ways. And one of the ideas was based on the fact that my father used to give Castro little gifts on his trips down there. And so he had this idea. Typically, he would tell the CIA to go out and buy it. And so he asked them to go out and buy a skin diving suit. Now, I think my father must have been suspicious, because the CIA plot was to poison the wetsuit, give it to my father, who wouldn't even know about it, give it to Castro, and then Castro would be assassinated. Now, can you imagine what might have happened after that? This was right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This might have reignited the whole world confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union if a thing like that occurred. And also, John Donovan would not be standing in the Yonkers YMCA giving you this talk right now, I don't think, because things might have happened right then and there. And I'll jump ahead just for a moment to tell you that this was a big year for assassinations. The Kennedy assassination occurred that year. And to this day, one of the theories about the Kennedy assassination was that it was payback for CIA or US government attempts against Castro's life, and that Castro was responsible. There was a documentary produced just last year making that kind of a case. I'm not going to come down one way or the other about it. There are 100 different books on this subject, but it is possible. And Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, went to his grave believing that that was the case. And so these assassinations might well be tied up with one another. But we started off that trip early in the morning at Castro's beach house on the north shore of Cuba. And Castro was feeling very sort of jolly that morning. As he was talking about, he said, today we're going to go and we are going to find the ladyfish. So of course we said, the ladyfish, what's that? And it's some kind of legend among the fishermen at the Bay of Pigs that there is this gigantic fish that appears once in a while. So anyway, I always remember that, because I feel like our whole trip with Castro across Cuba was like a search for the ladyfish. In other words, what he was doing was giving us this idea of a utopia. He was trying to remake the whole of the Cuban society. And he was saying, well, over there you see those new housing projects, and we just built those. And then he was talking about the agricultural aspect of it, you know. And it was really searching for the ladyfish, because so many of these things are just trying to defy reality. You take the agricultural part of it, for instance. You know that 5 million people died in the Ukraine back around 1932 trying to collectivize agriculture and so forth. None of that has ever really worked, and yet there he is in 1963 doing the same thing. In other words, he's trying to defy historical reality and make up his own reality. And a lot of people were doing that. In fact, all of us have a little bit of a tendency to do that. We want to shape reality according to our own wishes sometime, and we have to discipline ourselves personally and in organizations to avoid doing that. But we got down to the Bay of Pigs, and Castro was, do I have this right? Castro was talking about how basically he wanted to become normalizing his relationships with the United States. And the conversation turned to me at one point about what I was going to be doing that summer, which was I was going to take a trip with a friend of mine over to Norway. And so that had Castro talking about Scandinavia, and he was saying, well, I want Cuba to be like Scandinavia. That is some kind of middle way between the Soviet Union and the United States. You see, basically, the Soviet Union was bossing him around at the time about foreign policy, and he wanted to become more independent by normalizing relations with the U.S., maintaining relations with the Soviet, and balancing one off the other. That's really what was going on. But that leads up to my next story. That summer, just starting a couple of months later, I and a friend of mine went over to Norway. We had a job on at a ship repair company in Oslo on the fjord, on the waterfront. And that was interesting in part because that was another example of how a country is trying to create its own ideal reality. Norway, Sweden, and Finland were doing that. And we were learning something about that, democratic socialism and so forth. It's just another idea like that. And I'll tell you, there's another thing going on at the time that which is the beginning of the Bohemian movement or the hippie movement. And my friend and I were into that a little bit. We didn't grow the long hair. We weren't really into rock and roll and certain things like that. But the basic attitude of creating your own reality was something that But anyway, it worked because that's my Berlin story, which I will not forget. And so later that year, I started school at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service in Washington. And that was a year of assassinations, as I said, because about a month later, a woman named Madame New came and visited our university. And she was in the inner circle of the ruling circle in Saigon. And but she was always making outrageous statements, and she was part of a problem over there. But anyway, that government over in Saigon, 2 weeks later, after this visit in Washington, while she was still in the United States, in fact, was overthrown. And that set up a whole different situation with regard to Vietnam. And I became part of that myself. This is a picture of Kennedy at the Berlin Wall. I'll mention a little something about Vietnam because we have veterans of Vietnam observe that. And it came out in later years, as I think I mentioned a little while ago. There are many theories about that. But Lyndon Johnson, and I heard even Richard Nixon also believed that it was Castro doing that as payback. I'll tell you briefly, I have one little other theory about it. Personally, I don't think it was Castro himself, but I think it was quite possibly someone from the Cuban government, because Castro kind of believed in himself and his own rule there, but there were others in the government who were totally in sync with the Soviet Union, and they were a whole different crowd from even Castro himself. And so, personally, I think if I were investigating the whole thing, that's the group that I would be looking at. Anyway, that occurred, the funeral cortege occurred, and it tied together, I think, at least in a sense, 1963 as a year of assassinations and of danger. Now we're 50 years later. And I have just recently come back from a trip that I would like to tell you a little bit about. My wife and I flew over to Oslo, Norway, where Mikhail Gorbachev had received the Nobel Prize. Gorbachev, as you remember, was very instrumental in ending the Cold War, because when Solidarity in Poland began to declare their independence and the Polish government fell, then it became like dominoes throughout Eastern Europe, and Gorbachev made the decision not to interfere with that, but instead to engage people at different levels, including President Reagan and so forth. Anyway, we flew into Oslo. This was just a few weeks ago. We checked into a hotel. We were scheduled to be on a cruise, and the people who were on our cruise were all at this hotel, and Mikhail Gorbachev himself came in and he gave us a talk. And so it was interesting that he said, in part, that you can't depend on any theory of history, that human beings have to take action themselves. So I think he was mainly talking about the theory of history in which Karl Marx said that there would be an inevitable march toward what they called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and we would all have communism, in other words. And that's what communism was based on, was this historical theory. But so far as I'm concerned, as far as most people, even Mikhail Gorbachev, are concerned, that does not reflect historical reality. That there is no, my personal view is about divine providence. I think the Lord watches over all the events of history, including the history of your individual lives, including the things that go on, the small things that may go on in your life today and tomorrow. Everything is being watched over by the Lord our God. That's my view. Gorbachev, I don't know, I don't think that he shares that, but at least he's rejecting this Marxist view about history. That's what he had to say in Oslo. Well, we got on this boat, this ship, and we're out in the Baltic. And we're moving toward Gdansk, Poland. That's where the whole counter-revolution started. The key figure there, as you may remember, was Lech Walesa. L-E-C-H, W-A-L-E-S-A, it comes out somehow, Walesa. And so we went over to the shipyards where this occurred. And I want to mention, by the way, that the Pope at that time was Polish, a new Pope, and he came and visited Poland. That kind of awakened the spiritual sensibilities of what is a Catholic country. And they have a little memorial right there in the shipyards as to where he was standing at that time. And all of this has much to do with changing world history. And so then Lech Walesa came onto the ship, our ship, and he gave a talk. And we had an opportunity to meet him. And I would like to just show you briefly this picture of myself, my wife, and of Poland after a while. But his main point was, don't depend on politicians. Don't depend on public policies. What you have to figure out are the values, and that's what you have to start debating. What the values, what do you believe in as a people? Now, I will tell you that he didn't himself begin to express what his values are for whatever reason. You know, people in those situations, they get into controversy so easily that maybe they like to avoid that a little bit. But he made that point very forcefully, that we have to learn that lesson in this country. You know, in the last election, it seemed to me like most of the people were saying, well, all we have to do is get this one into the White House, or this one into the State House, or this one into City Hall, then our problems would be solved. Sorry. It's too easy to do it that way. You know, we have problems such as killings in Yonkers and elsewhere, and we have solutions that are actually much closer to historical reality. You know, we had, just briefly, in the middle of the 19th century, they had killings and all of that going on in Manchester, England, those industrial revolution cities. And a man named George Williams, he didn't go to the Queen or to Parliament and say, you've got to have this policy or that politician. He started the YMCAs and addressed the issues of body, mind, and spirit. You know, and we have to re-spiritualize, re-moralize our culture, and that is the answer. And that, I think, is what Lech Walesa was basically saying right there in Gdansk, Poland, and what I'm saying to you right here and now. That is the answer. It's not an easy answer. It's not just being in favor of a certain candidate or a certain policy. It's a matter of doing certain things. We went from Gdansk, Poland, got back in the ship, and we went up to St. Petersburg, Russia. In 1917, that's where the whole Bolshevik Revolution started. We went to the Winter Palace, which is now called the Hermitage Museum. That's where it occurred. They called it the October Revolution. I'll tell you something. While I was on the ship, the seas got a little bit rough, but I was amazed And I was thinking about literally what I'm going to be saying in this talk today. And I wasn't sure which way to go. But the seas are getting kind of rough. And I thought, well, it's remarkable how steady this ship is. It's doing very well. And I realized that between now, and I actually was on a ship about 50 years ago, and the seas were like that, and the ship was doing a lot of rock and roll. You know, so I thought, well, the answer is they have improved the stabilizers on ships. Stabilizers. All right. I said, now I know what I'm going to say at the YMCA. We need stabilizers in our whole society. You know, any one of us could go off the rails, you know, based on, you know, getting angry or doing something that we're not supposed to be doing. The stabilizers are that we can be in fellowship with other people. We can be mentoring each other. We can be encouraging each other. You see what I mean? The stabilizers. Another stabilizer, just on the personal or individual level, is the Word of God. We can keep soaking in the Word of God, and that stabilizes us. But so there's the individual level, and then there's the social level. I don't mean politics. I mean connecting at a deeper level through mentoring and Bible study and various other things like that. Stabilizers. Now, we got into St. Petersburg, and so we were going through one fantastic palace after another. You know, everything was just gold and fantastic paintings by Raphael and so forth. 2 days of this. And finally, the tour guide turned to us, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Now you see why we had a revolution." And I did. You could really understand it, because you can imagine all these peasants are out there just making it from one meal to the next, if that, while Princess so-and-so and Empress or Tsarina so-and-so is planning her next grand ball with all her fantastically wealthy friends. You can understand. So the Bolsheviks got out there and they remade the world. Obviously, they didn't remake it the right way. You know, T.S. Eliot, the poet from around that time, there's one line of poetry I'd like to quote. He said, "They're trying to make a system so perfect that nobody has to be good. Everything's taken care of." Right? In other words, they're ignoring the individual side of this, okay? But anyway, those Bolsheviks, they remade the world all right. Solzhenitsyn, the writer, said that 110 million people died since the Bolsheviks started that revolution. And so, even though things didn't work out in Vietnam or in the Bay of Pigs and so forth, I don't apologize for having gone into battle against that kind of an evil system. It didn't work, and we have to be smart about these things, smarter than we used to be, because that's another part of reality, is a psychological reality. I don't think we figured that out in Cuba or in Vietnam. You know, that it's one thing to have the right philosophy. It's a second thing to be smart and have the right psychology and do things the right way at the right time. That's part of historical reality, too. So we have to remake society, not like Bolsheviks, not like Castro, but we have to do something. I'll close on this. Back in that time, the year before 1963, the great writer William Faulkner, he died in that year. He gave a Nobel Prize speech in which he stood up and he said, "The task of the writer is to remind people of the compassion and the greatness and the pity and the things that that give glory to our past." We have to remind people. That's what the writer's supposed to do, he said. All right. I'm saying, yes, we have to remind each other that, but we have to help each other with those things too, those character strengths. That is our task. let's begin that. Thank you. Okay. As long as they're easy questions. You might have to repeat whatever he says. One little gift I got from the Marine Corps, these hearing aids. I was a machine gunner, so I can't hear very well.
What is your view now on the way the system is now, how different it was, like, from your time when the president was assassinated? You know, how much of a revolution do you think has occurred?
In the United States?
Yes.
I think that the main thing that has happened in the United States is at the local social level. And unfortunately, this is why we need to have some kind of a cultural revolution right now. You know, we're looking at the killings in Yonkers and so forth. A lot of that has to do with the fact that when I was growing up in New York City, 5%, well, not to over-focus on the inner city so much, let's talk about the population in general, 5% were without fathers. Now it's over 40%. And if you look at the killings that are going on, or the people that are in prison, about 90% of all prisoners don't have a good recollection of a father. You know, so these are the kinds of things that are going on, and the prisons are 4.5 times bigger today than they were in the mid-'80s. Now, you can't just have some policy coming out of Washington or coming out of Albany or City Hall that's going to turn that all around. We all need to be involved, and not just because of killings and things that are as drastic as that. There's all kinds of other kinds of unhappiness. That is the main thing that we have to focus on. You don't read about it as much in the papers because I was a newspaper reporter years ago myself, and you put what you're looking for in the paper, the people, are events, you know, things that in controversies and so forth, and not slow-growing trends. But it's this slow-growing trend that making all the difference now, and that's what has to be addressed. Any other questions?
You made a good statement about how the Lord oversees all of the events in history that have been taking place, and to this present moment now. I believe that, you know, the way that the government is structured, like you said, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, Popovich.
In Poland?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
He created that system that allowed millions of people to die, right?
Not in Poland. I mentioned about the Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine, that part of the world, and I feel like it started there, and it's in the United States, and it's rapidly growing. Because the reason why I say that is because we're not doing nothing about poverty, we're not doing nothing about the peasants of this modern day. You know, we're just, like you said, the government has just created a perfect system that will take care of everything. And by having that kind of system, we're getting all these guns and, well, we're getting all these violence and killings and you know, it's up to the people to system created so they would, you know, get rid of us. They got the police, they got the SWAT team, they got all those kinds of, you know, different teams. And, you know, no disrespect to the soldiers or anybody, you know, that's trying to fight for the country, but it's, you know, it's just, it's not worth it, you know.
Well, do we have to try to address it always from the political level? Sure, there are certain things at the political level right here and now that should undoubtedly change. You know, I'm not here to really take sides about that so much as to say, like Lech Walesa said, that we have to figure it out at the local level. You know, and it's still important, of course, what happens at the political level. It's interesting about, I want to make another point about the historical reality. You see Khrushchev is over here, and Castro is visiting Khrushchev, and Khrushchev has a son. He's 78 years old. I only found out about this last year. He lives in Rhode Island. So I thought, I'll call him up. I'll see if I can take him out to lunch. It worked out. I called him up. I went up to Providence, Rhode Island. I'm sitting at lunch with Khrushchev's son. And one of the things he said about that relates to this historical reality. I said to him, you know, what? You know, I started to ask him about communism. He said, it doesn't fit the human psychological reality because people are naturally competitive. And it's true. He said he was working in a scientific organization. And he said everybody was competing with everybody else. And he said he began to realize that's human nature. You know, so you can't just impose all of this, you know, a kind of system that makes everybody automatically equal. But anyway, you know, you're bringing up all the, you know, inequalities and the difficulties that are going on right now, and I'm saying that we can't just imagine that the politicians are going to solve all those problems, because there isn't, partly because they themselves are, you know, they're very human, but even the best, if we even had the most perfect, intelligent politicians at every level of government, the problems would still not be solved, because we have to take it upon ourselves. You know, it's hard to say what in particular we can do as individuals. You know, I'm a retired guy. You know, I'll tell you a little story. I just moved into a little condo up in Connecticut. So I had the moving van come, and a team of guys, they came in. And after they put all my stuff into the condo, the head of the moving company, or the team, he turned to me and he said, "So, you were working in New York in business, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "So now you're retired, right?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, there's the sofa, there's the TV, you're good to go." You know, in other words, that was his idea of just being free, you know. Being free for some people is just not doing anything. So, you know, so every day I wonder, you know, what am I supposed to be doing? You can ask yourself that question, you know, every day. I know one thing, I'm not supposed to be sitting on that sofa looking at the TV, you know. I mean, that much I know, but then that's what I'm not supposed to do. What am I supposed to do? Well, I live in a city called Norwalk. It's about half the size of Yonkers, and so I get engaged in different ways around Norwalk, and we're figuring all of that out. And I believe in trying to ask the Lord, you know, what I should do, and not always coming up with my own ideas. Because sometimes in my life I have come up with my own ideas, and other people have said, "I wish you hadn't done that," you know. So we can't depend on ourselves. We depend on God, and we depend on others. Just yesterday, I have these mentoring relationships with people. And I was with a guy yesterday. And he said a couple of things to me. I never would have thought of them for myself, but I needed to hear them. That's the way life works. That's the way God works. That's the way society works. I needed to hear. There's a little bit of correction, and it was a little bit of encouragement, but it was a little bit of direction about where I ought to focus my energies. And I wouldn't have had that. Each one of you should have that kind of a relationship. Not because I know you and think that you're weak or not smart enough or anything like that, but because I believe that is the way human beings were made by God, not to be self-sufficient, but to depend on others. That's the way we're made. Yes, sir.
As a journalist and a believer,
Yeah.
do you find it difficult sometimes with the way that journalism is handled these days? It seems to me one group will have an agenda that they want us to believe, and they'll stand on one, instead of telling us what the news is, they're trying to tell us, to me, what to think.
Sure.
How do you feel about that as a believer and as a journalist?
I think that's, of course, a very important problem. But I think an even bigger problem is that it's become so superficial. You know, when is the last time you heard anything, any kind of analysis on the news about what I was saying a couple of minutes ago about the general trend in culture? All you hear about are the controversies, and you don't get an in-depth approach. You know, some of the most important problems right now happen to be very, very complicated. One of which is the business of financial regulation. You have to really understand and to study what this is. You're not going to hear that. You didn't even hear that in the presidential elections. So that's one of the problems with journalism. And of course, with the internet, journalism is beginning to disappear so far as print journalism is concerned. Even the New York Times is, you know, finding it hard to make money. The newspaper I used to work for out in Erie, Pennsylvania, is struggling. It's losing money. All the newspapers are. That's not a very good trend. You know, the internet is just becoming more and more superficial, television broadcasting. But the problem of bias has been going on for, of course, a very long time. You know, of course, depends on the old days. All the big Eastern papers had a liberal bias. Then there were certain papers elsewhere that had, you know, the conservative bias. And of course, you get these various personalities out there who are, you know, filling the airways with their personal views and so forth. And it can also be very polarizing. You know, you can get into these things that are so controversial. I'll just mention one of the hot button issues these days. That's abortion. I happen to be on the conservative side of it myself, but I don't think that whether it's legal or illegal is as important as whether or not we begin to create a whole culture in which abortion becomes unnecessary. See, that's where we have to get in at a much deeper level through our churches, why we have to re-spiritualize our society through the churches. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Everybody in society is not always about church. There are many different people that believe in scientific methods and all of that. So everybody can't be on the same level because many people believe in many different things.
That's true. And so Lech Walesa made that very point, and he said we have to begin to engage in debate. That would have been his answer to that. There certainly have to be all the different nonprofit organizations, whether they're churches, we have to begin to join and connect again. I spoke at the Rotary Club, for instance, a couple of weeks ago. All those kinds of clubs are way down in membership because people are too busy with their little machines and they're not connecting at the personal level. But anyway, all the different kinds of organizations have to get involved. But I'll tell you one thing that is universal among all the philosophies and all the religions if you study them. And it is the idea that people should have character strengths. I want to tell you a little anecdote about that. Back in the 70s, I had a friend who was a journalist. He was, in fact, he died about 1985, but he was a famous journalist back in the 70s. And I was on Capitol Hill myself during the Watergate episode, and I knew this guy. Now, here's a guy, he did not regard himself as a religious believer. And meanwhile, he's about 55 years old, and he's running around with 23-year-old girls, and he's drinking up a storm every day, and he's acting like somebody that doesn't have any morality. Now, here's an interesting thing. He wrote a book. And a very good book, a very interesting book. And you can get it on Amazon, which in fact I did just a month ago. And it's on a subject that nobody talks about, not even in the churches. It's the subject of sin. And it's called The 7 Deadly Sins Today. Now remember, this is a guy who is not a religious believer. But let me tell you, this is one very smart guy who could see what was going on in society, and he could see that it was basically the old concept of sin, or character weakness, or vice, or whatever you want to call it, that was tearing up society apart. He didn't know what to do about it in his own life, but as I say, this was a good book. He could explain to you what it was doing. Somehow, somewhere, it has to be dealt with. The issues have to be dealt with. So in mid-19th century England, they dealt with it through the YMCA. They're saying not only should we believe certain things, but we should take certain kinds of actions and help one another in certain kinds of ways. We have to do it at that level, and not just at the level of policy where we don't talk about character.
I heard some years ago that there was, communists, because they were not, there was not an actual war, but it was a war of ideals, so to speak, a war of different views, that somehow there was a plan to undermine America, undermine the values of America.
I've heard that.
And the first value, or one of the values was going to be undermined was discipline.
Right.
That it would not be the authority of the parents would not be respected, but that the children would be the ones that would have authority over the parents. That one of the things to undermine.
Right.
One of those bases of society. You said you heard of it. Do you know anything more? In fact, was there a plan? If there was a plan, it seems like some of the things that I've heard about are happening or have happened over the years. So that morally, America is a weak.
Right. Well, I have seen something that's in the category of real conspiracy theory, and it's, you have to spend an awful long time trying to, investigate that to come to a conclusion, and I don't usually take the time to do that. But certainly there were many people like that who were trying to basically infiltrate the hippie movement, which was total freedom all the time, and societies do fall that way. Weimar Germany, in other words, the Germany of the 20s was the most corrupt imaginable society. Anything goes, sexuality and all of that. And that ushered in Hitler. Okay, there's another thing I'd like to mention, something I was going to mention before. What are we dealing with now? What is the biggest threat out there? It's radical Islam. I mean, the kind of Islam in which they want to take over the whole society and to have a top-down discipline. That's like communism. Communism wanted to do the same thing. You have a top-down discipline. So for radical Islam, that means, as you well know, you dress up the women from top to bottom in something. You kill people for committing adultery and all of that. Now, here's what I wanted to say. When the 9/11 event occurred in the Trade Center in 2001, I happened to call up a friend of mine just because I hadn't talked to him in a long while, to see how he was. So I asked him, how are you? And he said, I'm not doing so well. My son just got killed in the Trade Center attack. And so, of course, I extended my condolences about that. And we had a long conversation about many aspects of that. And as you all remember, everybody was just traumatized by all of this. And of course, that goes double for anybody whose own son or wife or daughter was killed there, right? So anyway, I began to talk to him about some things that were going on historically in Pakistan, Afghanistan, so on, back in the 80s. And he said, well, that's very interesting. I'll tell you something. This was about, I think, 2.5 weeks after the attack. He said, I'm organizing a group of 9/11 families. And we are having an organizing meeting over in Ridgewood, New Jersey next week. Would you come over there and talk to us about what you have just been telling me? So I said, sure. So I show up, and there's a group a little bit bigger than this one right here, every one of whom had a son or a daughter or a father or somebody killed in the 9/11 attack. So I gave my little talk about things going on in the 80s and all of that. And then there was a silence. And these are people in distress, right? So finally a guy raises his hand and he says, why do they hate us so much? So I said, well, there are many ways to explain that, of course. You can talk about military things going on. You could talk about the Israel versus Palestine situation. I'd like to answer the question in a different way. We, in America, are exporting all of our worst cultural examples through television, through pornography, through the internet, through movies, right into these very traditional and sometimes fragile cultures, and some people over there are angry about it. And if you have a lot of people who are angry, you're going to have maybe a small group who will do something drastic, like fly an airplane into a building. So I thought maybe I was going to be offending people because we were I was half, making it sound half reasonable. And of course, I have no sympathy for terrorism or for radical Islam or anything like that. And I have the maximum of sympathy for the people I was talking with. But still, I regard the cultural breakdown that we are experiencing here and everywhere in this country as a national security issue. We should look at it that way. Okay, thank you very much. Father, this set of dominoes which I have at home. I should have brought them, I forgot today.
You gave him a gift of a camera and a wetsuit?
That's right.
Okay,
And a month later, after our visit, Castro was standing in Red Square like a tourist, and it was on the front page of the New York Times taking pictures, and that was that camera. Yeah. There's actually another little part to that. I mentioned about how I had lunch with Khrushchev's son. Before I went up to see him, I went to the library and I found a book written by this guy, Sergei Khrushchev. And in the middle of it, Castro is taking a photograph of the whole Khrushchev family. Nikita, his wife, Sergei, and about 3 others. And it was the same camera. Yeah. Oh.